Tel Aviv being hit by waves of Iranian Khorramshahr-4 missiles matters for one reason above all. This is no longer just a cycle of retaliation. It is a contest over whether Israel can preserve normal life under sustained long-range pressure, and whether Iran can prove that even one of the most defended states on earth can be forced into repeated disruption. That is what the word paralyzed really means in this context. Not that the Israeli state collapsed, not that the army disappeared, but that Iran demonstrated an ability to drag the country back into emergency mode again and again, with sirens, shelter orders, travel disruption, air defense strain, and a public that is never fully allowed to relax. The strategic message is bigger than the visible damage. The message is that routine itself has become a battlefield. If you follow this channel for clear, serious breakdowns of wars like this, subscribe now, because the real story here is not the explosion you saw on screen. It is the shift in the balance of pressure underneath it. The Khorramshahr-4 matters, because it sits in a very specific category of Iranian power. It is a medium-range ballistic missile, road-mobile, liquid-fueled, and built to carry a heavy warhead over the distance required to hold Israel at risk. In plain English, this is not a harassment weapon. It is part of Iran's effort to maintain a dip strike capability that can threaten cities, air bases, infrastructure, and decision-making centers from well beyond Israel's borders. And that changes the meaning of every launch. A missile like this does not only threaten the point of impact, it threatens the entire defensive ecosystem around the impact. Radar has to track it. Command systems have to classify it. Interceptors have to be assigned. Civilians have to move. Flights can be delayed or halted. Emergency services have to mobilize before anyone even knows whether the missile will land, be intercepted, or break apart into dangerous debris. The attack begins affecting the target long before the warhead arrives. This is also why people misunderstand Israeli missile defense. Israel does have one of the most sophisticated layered systems in the world, but that does not mean it has a magical shield. Iron Dome gets most of the headlines, yet long-range ballistic threats pull in higher layers like David's Sling and the Arrow systems. Those layers are advanced, but they're not infinite. And when the attacker can launch in waves, the defense is forced into a problem of depth, timing, and cost. That is the real logic of saturation. You do not need every missile to land for the attack to work. You need enough missiles to force the defender into repeated cycles of interception, uncertainty, and social disruption. Even intercepted missiles can produce consequences through debris, panic, delays, and the sheer demand they place on the defensive network. In modern war, the attacker is not only trying to destroy targets, he is trying to overload the target's rhythm. Tell me in the comments whether you think this war is still mainly about deterrence, or whether it has already crossed into a long-term war of attrition between two states that now know they can hit each other directly. And that is exactly why Tel Aviv matters so much. Tel Aviv is not just another city. It is Israel's economic engine, a technological hub, a psychological center of national confidence, and a symbol of modern normality. When missile waves reach Tel Aviv, Iran is not merely trying to cause damage. It is trying to send a strategic message. We can reach the core, not just the periphery. We can touch the place that represents your stability, your markets, your airports, your daily life, and your sense of control. That message becomes even more powerful when it lands in a wider environment of disruption. Israel has already operated under emergency restrictions, including school closures, limits on gatherings, and underground hospital operations. Ben Gurion has seen damage from missile debris, and broader air traffic has been disrupted by the war. So when another wave hits central Israel, the effect is cumulative. The strike is not arriving into calm. It is landing on top of fatigue, logistical stress, and a society that understands the next siren may only be hours away. This is where the Iranian strategy becomes clearer. Tehran does not need to conquer Israel. It does not need to defeat the Israeli Air Force in a conventional sense. It needs to prove that Israeli superiority from the air cannot produce total immunity at home. That is a much narrower goal, but it is also far more achievable. If Iran can keep showing that it retains missile reach after weeks of war, then it weakens the idea that Israel can dictate escalation at low domestic cost, and that matters politically as much as militarily. More than 6 weeks into this war, the problem for Israel is not that it lacks firepower. The problem is that tactical success has not automatically produced a decisive strategic outcome. Iran has taken punishment, but it has not disappeared. Its missile capability has not been erased. Its ability to impose costs has not vanished. So every successful strike or partial penetration into central Israel becomes part of a larger argument that this war may be easier to start than to finish. And if you value this kind of analysis, hit like, because most coverage stops at the blast and never gets to the strategic equation the blast is meant to change. There is another layer here that may be even more important. These missile waves are not only aimed at Israel, they are aimed at Washington, the Gulf states, global energy markets, and every regional actor watching the conflict unfold. Iran is signaling that it can survive pressure and still threaten the wider system. It can target Israel, complicate air traffic, unsettle investors, and keep the region on edge while also reminding everyone that escalation with Tehran never stays neatly contained. That is why the Khorramshahr-4 is significant beyond its hardware. The missile is part of a doctrine that says strategic resilience is not measured by avoiding damage, but by continuing to impose consequences after absorbing damage. In the framework, the point of the missile is not just destruction. It is proof of continued relevance. Proof that the state launching it still has escalation options, still has deterrent value, and still has a vote in how the war develops. So when people say Tel Aviv was hit and Israel was paralyzed, the serious reading is not apocalyptic. It is structural. Iran showed that repeated long-range missile pressure can interrupt normal life, stress expensive defenses, and force Israel to defend not only its skies, but its sense of continuity. That is a major strategic fact, even if most incoming missiles are intercepted, and even if the physical destruction remains limited compared to the worst-case scenario. And that is the deeper conclusion. The real danger for Israel is not a single spectacular strike. It is the normalization of recurring disruption. Once a rival proves it can repeatedly reach your center, the burden shifts. Now you must reassure markets, protect infrastructure, conserve interceptors, manage public morale, and still convince your population that control remains intact. In other words, the battlefield expands from territory to time, from damage to endurance, from the front line to the national nervous system. That is why this story matters so much. Not because one barrage ended Israel. It did not. But because each wave of missiles chips away at the illusion that technological superiority alone can restore strategic calm. Tel Aviv being hit is the visible event. The more important event is what sits underneath it. Iran is demonstrating that it can keep turning Israeli normality into a target, and that may be the most consequential shift in this war so far. Share this with someone who still thinks missile warfare is only about what gets destroyed on impact, because in this conflict, the deeper objective is to disrupt, exhaust, and reshape the balance of pressure long before either side can claim victory.